Today in class we started our look at the French Revolution, and tonight for homework I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the political dimensions in which the French government ran and French society existed prior to the revolution. It's going to be relatively short and it's going to be in two parts, one for tonight and one for tomorrow night. So we are going to begin with just an overview. So these are the 4 points that we're going to be looking at for tonight. And the first is absolute monarchy. What is it? What does it mean? And what does it tell us about the role of the French king? The second is divine right, then the method of rule by the king, and also the limits to his power. And we're not going to go through all of the limits. Some of that will be touched on next lesson as well. So absolute monarchy. Here is a quote from Jacques Bousseau. In the exercise of lawful authority, the king is, and ought to be, absolute. That is, so far as absolute, that there is no legal authority which can delay or resist him. And Jacques Bousseau was a bishop and spokesman for Louis XIV. Now, this is an excellent quote because it gives us an understanding of the extent to which the king had authority over essentially every aspect of life within France during this time. There is no legal authority which can delay or resist him. Now, that's not exactly true, and we're going to see that a little bit more later on in this session, but it is indicative of the fact that there was no body or individual that could possibly challenge the power and authority of the monarchy. And this was a a political concept, which was heavily ingrained within French society, that the king was absolute, that his power was absolute. And this was strongly reinforced by the concept of divine right, which is the king in his palace is the image of God in his heaven, who sets the whole of nature in motion. Again, from Jacques Bousseau. He was a really big fanboy of the king. Now, this essentially shows us that if you were to criticize the king, you were to criticize God, because the king is God's representative and image here upon earth. You can kind of draw parallels between the Catholic interpretation of the Pope and then the French belief of the king being the image of God, although that's possibly too far a bow to string. But let's move on. Now, within this shows us that the power of the king and the influence of the church are strongly interrelated. And you're going to see that more and more as we get into the order and nature of French society, but we're not going to touch on that today. So moving on now to the methods of rule. So the king had authority, but he was still guided and to an extent restricted by tradition that had governed French society for many years, and also by laws that were in place. So although the king theoretically was bound by by tradition and by the laws, he could, if he wanted to, circumvent and just say, no, I'm the king, this is what I want to do. But he generally didn't, to keep the general populace happy and to keep the nobility happy with his rule. So he ruled through a council, what's called a council of state, and they were essentially ministers who would enact his laws and decrees as he said so. The king, though, was able to replace these members at will. If he didn't like them, he could boot them out. And that essentially meant that if somebody disagreed with any of his laws, the person wasn't really going to say, hey, king, I think you're wrong, because the king could simply say, get off my council, and he would have to agree. So that meant that essentially the Council of State were just people that enacted the king's decrees without putting any checks or balances into what he was actually deciding. They also did advise him as well, and so that was an influence upon the king's decisions, but again, they didn't actually have authority to change anything that the king decreed. Now, the royal governors were individuals that oversaw the excessively complex political and administrative division of France. Now, I'm not going to go into detail of that now, that will be in the next session, but The royal governors were the ones who were sent the decrees and laws that the king wanted to have enacted, and they were the ones that put it into, they were the ones that enacted them within the provinces. The thing is, though, the king only knew the state of his nation, as in whether there was a famine or a food shortage, or whether there were issues or positive production in different areas. He only knew what was going on in the different regions and provinces of France through the reports of these royal governors. So that then leads to reason that the governors were able to, if they wanted to, and this is just theorizing, they were able to mask the information that the king received. And it's possible that the king actually wasn't aware of the reality of life and existence within the different areas of his provinces, because to be honest, if you're a provincial governor, or a royal governor, sorry, you are going to be making your province seem like it is going well, otherwise you can easily be removed from your position. So the reports that the king received may not have actually been accurate, but that's just me theorizing. Okay, you can just disagree with me, that's not a problem at all. Now, there were actually limits to the king's power. As I mentioned before, there was a large body of tradition that the king generally had to abide by as well, and there were laws within France, although there was actually no written constitution that the king had to abide by. So laws could be amended and changed as required. Now, there were high law courts, which were called parliaments. Now, you need to make sure that you don't confuse this with our kind of English Western understanding of parliaments as an elected body of representatives. That's not what this is. The French version of parliament, which is spelled differently, is actually the law courts, and it's the high law courts. There were 13 of them spread throughout France, and there were 13 legal jurisdictions that these law courts had jurisdiction over. And they had, their initial function was to make sure that the laws were copied down exactly as they were in Paris, or as in Versailles, which is where the king lived, and then spread throughout the provinces. So they're making sure that basically the scribes or the print copiers were taking down the laws exactly, and making sure that they were exactly disseminated to the populace, the public. However, they had this ability to request a remonstrance, which is essentially a memo where they would put a pause on spreading out or sending out the laws that had been sent from Versailles, and saying, I think there's an issue with this, can you clarify this one particular point? It's essentially just a check to clarify the wording of the laws that were being sent. And this eventually, over time, was used as a method of indicating disapproval or protest against the laws of the king. The parliaments were able to delay the sending out of laws from the king as an act of opposition or as an act of defiance. Now, Louis XV, after the opposition of the parliaments throughout the 1750s and 1760s, actually stripped away these powers in 1770. He sacked about half of the judges and lawyers of the parliaments. He actually removed some of them as well. And this, for a short while, solved the problems. However, he died, and Louis XVI, in 774, gave back many of the powers to the parliaments to try and get this popular appeal. Now, the parliaments didn't immediately start using these remonstrance powers again to oppose the king because they'd seen the extent of his power, but it will become more important later on as we talk about how the revolution actually occurred. So for next lesson, what you need to be doing is going to the website URL that I've listed here from alphahistory.com, and you are going to be reading a short source about the powers of the king. It's actually an extract from a speech in November 1787. It's pretty cool. It's over, let's do the maths, over 200 years old. And what I want you to do is to read this and consider what it tells us about the authority and power of the French king. It's really short. It's only about 2 paragraphs long, if that. And we are going to be answering a few questions, having a discussion about this in class. So can you please make sure that you have read it? I will have printed copies for you in class. Thanks very much.